chain. One other interesting thing I've noted over the last 8 months, Jason, is that our supplier response rate is going up quite a bit. So I do think the supply chain is maturing on this topic, and they are increasingly able to provide this information, whether they just understand it better or maybe they've had time, to go down their supply chain and have it come back up. But I do think that's good news for manufacturers in trying to understand where these PFAS might be found. So let's jump in a little bit to you and AEM, and especially the AEM members. What are some of the biggest concerns that they have around all of these emerging regulations on the use of PFAS?
So the biggest concern that I think our members have, first and foremost, is loss of access to markets. So wherever this is regulated, if the regulation is sufficiently stringent, so if they're going to ban PFAS in any sort of form, which we've seen a few of those iterations around the world, and you have it in your equipment, you would lose access to that market if it's being enforced correctly. So that is likely the largest concern that our member companies have. And obviously most companies that is critical part of their products and components, that's going to be a major concern as well. An additional concern that they're going to have is as you lose some of the PFAS due to regulation, if this continues to go as it is, you're going to start seeing the chemical manufacturing industry and then so forth down the value chain start to remove these chemicals from their products, which means you as a manufacturer aren't going to have access to those chemicals. Speaking for the off-road equipment industry, we are using PFAS in a variety of applications. As you just sort of discussed there's a few very big ticket PFAS specific chemistries like PTFE, which are used. They're very useful. They provide a lot of useful features if you're building, and I'll just speak from my industry, heavy equipment, which requires durability, safety, performance aspects. And if you lose access to these PFAS chemistries and you don't have viable replacements, which for many of these, we don't have replacements which are going to be able to perform up to the same level that PFAS is, well, now the components you're going to use, the equipment you're going to build is not going to have those critical functionalities. So this could result in a number of different things. It could result, if you're using it in sealing technology and you're using hydraulics, you could have loss of pressure, which means massive safety concerns, damage to the machine, severe performance issues, quality problems. How long do these components live if they don't have the durability that you expect? If you are driving a car down the road, or if you are flying an airplane that relies on these substances in a component which is providing the functionality to keep that plane in the sky, what happens if you do not have that? So losing access to this family of chemistries is a major concern from them. And then what comes out at the other end, because now let's say they do go forward and they find alternatives that do not perform quite up to that level. Well, now you've got a machine that now has new liability concerns, which means redevelopment costs, risk assessments. How do you operate in this environment? And then one of the other big ticket items here is, even if you can comply with everything, and even if they're not extremely restrictive on where you could sell PFAS, the sheer number of different emerging PFAS regulations that are all sort of popping up with slightly different requirements each time balloons your compliance costs. It means that you have to spend more money trying to understand what the rule is, collect different forms of data, perform different activities to meet whatever requirement is in whichever jurisdiction you're trying to sell into. So there's a whole host of different concerns around the PFAS regulatory world that we're starting to see.
Before I move to the next slide, I just want to pull out a few things that you talked about, because I'm often asked, what is the biggest risk? What's the biggest regulation? And regulations, of course, super important. Ethical companies follow the regulations. But I also agree that actually the supply chain obsolescence is probably a bigger risk to manufacturers. And I'm really glad that you pointed out the product design impact, because I think a lot of companies aren't thinking through the whole story, right? And so if you have to replace PFAS with something that doesn't perform as well, it absolutely is going to impact the performance of your product itself. You may lose certifications and have to spend money not only redesigning, but now requalifying your products for those markets. It's the same thing that when, ROS 2 came around and we had to redesign a lot of our electronics, there's a lot of concern that the lead-free solder wouldn't perform the same way as the lead-based solder. You had to relay out circuit boards. So losing PFAS, even if there were a viable alternative, could still have that design impact down the road. And I really think a lot of companies aren't thinking through all of those implications. And to me, that's tied more to supply chain obsolescence, or at least as much to that as the regulations. I'll also share one other thing that I've picked up from some of the companies I've spoken with. They're actually increasingly concerned about their warranties and replacement parts and what the elimination of PFAS is going to do. And I know some companies have actually shortened their warranty periods because they're not confident that whatever they replace these parts with are going to last as long. So again, I think there's a lot of fallout implications from the redesign that may be required. And companies aren't planning for that or thinking about it. And that's the one that actually, to me, is the biggest concern for manufacturers, beyond, of course, just complying with the regulations themselves. Speaking of regulations, how on earth do you suggest that companies keep track? You just mentioned this, tsunami of PFAS-related regulations. Sometimes PFAS are added to existing regulations, right? Like the REACH restriction list. Sometimes it's a brand new, especially at the state level. I personally always recommend to compliance professionals to be subscribing to the WTO's Technical Barriers to Trade notification system, which can give them notification on what's coming up. This chart that I put together just shows the increase in the number of new product notifications every year since 1995. It's good job security for all of us, right, that work in product compliance. But how do your members keep track of these things? And I know this is something that you at AEM also support your members on.
Yeah. So I would always view this as a two-tiered approach. So there's the internal and external work that you can do. On an internal level, it means investing in whatever resources you can based on whatever your specific company and industry needs are, but investing internally to understand rulemaking, being able to prioritize where your highest priority markets are. So if you're really concerned about selling to the US and Canada specifically, understanding who your regulator is, where to look, and then through that you can, at least in some aspect, be able to track these regulations because you know specifically where to look. You're not just perusing the New York Times for information that they're really not going to give you. And so there's internal resources. You can invest in software, you can invest in consultants, you can try to have specific people that will do it on their own. But then when you sort of look beyond your own company's needs or what your own company can provide from a resource perspective, this is going to sound self-serving, but you join your trade association group, because if they're doing their job correctly, they are also looking at these requirements and they're trying to look at it around the world and also prioritize it. This is my day-to-day job, is trying to figure out where these risk points start popping up around the world. But when you have a group of members that are all in your industry, your competitors, they're all looking at the same requirements. They're all affected just like you are. And when you're in the trade association meetings and when you're discussing these sorts of things, you can glean information from your competitors on what they're concerned about. And then after a while, you as a group, as a trade association, can sort of develop that muscle memory, where to look, how to find these things, how to talk about them, and then hopefully, if you're really doing your job right, engage in it and sort of discuss things with regulators about how these rules affect your industry.
Yeah, for those who are maybe not engaged with AEM right now, I just want to say Jason does an amazing job of sending notices to his members when new things come out. So I know you're being a little humble about that, Jason, but I think that's an extremely valuable resource from the industry groups to your members. For those of you who aren't familiar with this WTO service, by the way, you can go to epingalert.org. That's EPING alert.org. And you can subscribe and get these notifications. But I think, Jason, like you mentioned, there's no perfect way to do this. And it's really a compilation of a bunch of resources. And there are people like yourselves, like my team, whose full-time job is to be keeping track of these. And we have a lot to keep track of. So, for example, the new Canada PFAS reporting rule that just came out a little over a week ago. If you're not familiar with what that is, just so that you're aware, Canada has their own PFAS rule now. It's not, of course, the same as the TSCA PFAS rule, but it does have an earlier compliance date, January 29th, coming up. So that's less than 6 months to provide information. And as I mentioned before, PTFE is our number one reported PFAS that is included in the Canada PFAS rule. So I think a lot of companies will be in scope, but this is a very complicated rule because there's de minimis levels, right? There's a much smaller list of PFAS that are required, just over 300. And is this something that, AEM is going to be helping their customers to, and their members to understand rules like this?
Yeah, so at AEM, we have specific committees where members will come together in this case to talk about chemical regulations more generally. This certainly fits into it. This rule did just come out within the last 2 weeks, I believe. So we're literally putting it on agenda as we speak this week to discuss it next week and what we do with it. Fortunately and unfortunately is that, the timing on this is very tight. This is extremely tight to collect this data. And it's very clear that ECCC, Environmental and Climate Change Canada, is just kind of expecting we have this information at the ready, which is not likely correct, but it's coming quickly. But fortunately, they have listed out around 250 so different chemicals specifically that they're looking at, which is different than the EPA rule, which is very much more expansive, much more broader. So the differences on there is what's going to get you, and that's where paying attention to these details and discussing it with your competitors in committees like the one that we sort of run at AEM is highly valuable, because then you can know if you're on the right track or not. They can pick out nuances. Obviously, at the end of the day, your own company's compliance is contingent on you doing your own work, but hearing from other people, understanding what the rules are, and then through AEM, what I plan on doing is submitting comments or at least a notification to regulatory officials to at least notify them that this rule, with the tight time windows, with the specific requirements, with what they're asking for, just help educate them on how difficult this sort of request is. And at least for my role at AEM, I don't really get to be the bad guy very often. And in this case, it's going to be a good cop kind of thing where I sort of tell them, if your policy goal is to collect this information to make smarter policy decisions down the road, having a longer timeline is what you really should be looking for, because it's a very complex question you ask across all of industry. It's even, I like to think our industry is very complex, but they ask for everybody. So that's much more complex, and helping educate them on what they're actually trying to do here and what the actual result's going to be is sort of part of the job.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be very interesting. Do you think that the ECCC, I don't know a good way to pronounce that acronym, but basically the Canadian version of the EPA, right? Do you think that they are assuming that a lot of companies do have the data because of the upcoming TSCA reporting rule, which they've known about for a longer time?
That I would assume so. So I do sit on a number of committees with ECCC, just sort of listening to their thoughts. I was aware that they were going to make some rule makings regarding PFAS. There's a report on the toxicity of non-fluoropolymer PFAS that they released, which is part of the rulemaking process, and then there was this one. It was clear from the discussions we've had that they're very aware of what is going on at EPA. They're also aware of many of the industry concerns, which is why I think instead of having an expansive definition of PFAS, in some places, like you have Minnesota on here, for instance, they have a much broader definition of what you need to report and regulate than even what the EPA does. And Canada, I think, as part of that awareness, knowing how difficult it is, tried to trim that down to a specific subset of known chemicals to them. It doesn't make the job any easier, because at the end of the day, and it was good hearing that the supply chains are reporting more and more and getting sharper in that respect. But still, I know from talking with my members that there is a lot of gaps. There is a lot of concern that there's not a lot of understanding. There's more education to be done. So from my industry standpoint, I think a broader industry concern is we still just don't have the data to report to you, to give you an accurate picture of what's actually being imported and used in Canada, which is where the major concern is going to come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not to keep harping on PTFE, but again, everyone has it, right? It's in my household's supply chain. But that the state of Minnesota did a webinar recently, and they were specifically asked if PTFE was in scope of Minnesota's requirements, and the regulator said absolutely. So you're right, Minnesota has a much broader definition than this Canadian rule, but it is the shortest turnaround time frame I've seen so far on one of these PFAS regulations. So from that point, I think that's pretty interesting to manufacturers. I am looking over at the questions as we go, and I'm not able to type my answers in, but I know several of you have asked about the WTO website again. I'll just spell it out again. It's EPINGALERT, so epingalert.org. And if you go to that, you're able to sign up for notifications on technical barriers to trade, which are basically product regulations. So moving on, Jason, past Canada, I do think one interesting side note of the data that we have been collecting is that even though, there are thousands, the EPA now has a list of over 17,000 different PFAS. Of all of the data that we've collected so far, around 100,000 parts that have PFAS declared in them, we've only identified 387 PFAS that are actually being reported. That number really surprises a lot of people because we really sweat the details on the individual PFAS and which ones are in scope of which regulations. But the truth is that chemical manufacturers have no profit in making 10,000 versions of slightly different, the same chemical. So 387, of that 387, 12 of them account for 72% of our reports. So it is possible now that we're starting to see more of an amassing of data for us to help our customers kind of start narrowing in on where are you more likely to find the PFAS? Which PFAS are you more likely to be seeing? What are the regulatory implications of those? So, for example, PTFE would have a very different regulatory burden, in my opinion, than PFOA, right? But now that we're able to start really zeroing in on some of these, do you feel that your members and your industry really have a good understanding of the risks? And specifically, I know you mentioned a few things before, but are there any specific applications based on what you've been seeing come in that are of particular concern?
So at the OEM level, the original equipment manufacturer level, I think they understand the impact quite well. So they understand that if these rules come in and the way that they're being written, that it has a major risk on their ability just to continue to operate at a base level. So they understand that. When you get into the supply chain for the off-road equipment industry, it starts to get a little hairier. So your tier ones likely understand what the risks are, but the further you move down, you start getting to really small suppliers out there, people that are making a single component, and they don't have the resources and bandwidth, and they're not employing chemists in their companies to assess these types of things. Not even to mention that at the chemical level or the chemical manufacturer level or the distributor level at that, when you go really far down or upstream, I suppose, they're not required to restrict or report these things yet. So there isn't an awareness in that mid-level of the supply chain over what is going into the components and products that they're making. So they're not aware of the risk going on them because they're not the regulated party. The end manufacturer is. So I would say it is a two-layered sort of system right now where the industry does understand it at the end point where they're producing product. But when you get in the middle point, there's a lot of confusion, misunderstanding, not awareness of the risk to their customers, essentially. Mm-hmm. Specifically, when you go into applications, where is PFAS being used? It's used to make parts more durable. It's used for heat resistance, chemical resistance, wear and tear. It's meant to make your products and components last longer and perform better. So we see this in sealing technology, so gaskets, O-rings, any Teflon coated hoses, all these sorts of things to ensure that liquid or gaseous products aren't leaking out of the machines. You have it in electronic components, which increasingly as we move into the digital world that we're moving into, that's everywhere in at least our equipment. You also have it in future technologies. So a lot of PFAS is included in battery technology. So as we're trying to move towards this green transition, you're literally a critical part of battery manufacturing or hydrogen fuel cell manufacturing will go off the table without PFAS. And there are no known replacements for many of these things, at least at a commercial market availability. I'm sure there's people out there trying to work on it, but in the medium to short term, we're not seeing anything on the horizon that can immediately replace these sorts of things. So there's a variety of different systems, at least in our industry, that are critically going to be impacted by the availability and regulatory issues associated with losing PFAS. So it is a kind of mixed answer here, but there is an awareness, at least at one level, of what the risks to their businesses are and where the major impact points are.
I do want to share another resource for people who are listening in, and I apologize, I don't have a slide for this, but ChemSec, which is a Swedish NGO, they actually have a PFAS guide where you can zero in by sector on where you're more likely to find PFAS. And in some cases, they even give suggestions for alternatives. So that's another good resource for companies that are just getting started and trying to narrow down where is my highest likelihood. So that's ChemSec, ChemSec.org, and you can get to their PFAS guide. But I think this is an important step one, right, is finding out which applications do you have PFAS in. You can't really understand your risk of all the product redesign that we talked about before, right, or what the impact of supply chain obsolescence will have on you until you know where you're using the PFAS and why. There are some applications that you can easily replace PFAS, and then there are others that, like you mentioned, a lot of the green energy transition relies on PFAS. Those are not so easily replaceable. So until you know what you're using and why, it's really hard to know what the true final impact is going to be. I did mention earlier that the supply chain is maturing on this topic. We've had over 2,500 suppliers identify PFAS in materials for our customers. And these are all over the world. These are not just US suppliers. These are not just EU suppliers, but a lot of Asian suppliers as well. So I do think that this is an international concern, but the international supply chain is stepping up. But as far as dealing with these international requirements, do you have a different strategy for those than, say, some of the state and federal? I continually say the U.S. states are the most aggressive on this particular topic. Part of that is because they don't have the framework they have to work through for a new law the way the federal government does, right? But do you think that there are different strategies that companies need to take for all of these different levels?
Yeah, I mean, the problem of the regulatory environment, especially around chemical rules, much less PFAS, is incredibly complex. The easiest way to do it, if we were living in a perfect world, is that you'd have a full material disclosure, like a full recipe list of every single chemical that goes into your product, literally just breaking it all the way down. And then from there, as we just discussed, you could prioritize which are the most important systems, which ones can go through redesigns, which ones, what can you live with, what can you live without. And then from there, responding to the different requirements becomes a lot easier if you have perfect knowledge of your machine or product, whatever it is. We don't have that right now, unless you make a really, really simple product, then you might have this sort of thing. But at that point, engaging in the regulations as they come, because at least in the developed world, so North America, Europe, places like Japan, Korea, Australia, you can respond to regulations, you can engage with regulators. So if you have major risk issues with a new rule, engaging with them, discussing what your issues are, helping educate them on what their requirements are and how they're going to affect you. And if you don't have the resource to do that, because a lot of companies are too small, it might not make sense for you to invest in that sort of thing, engaging with your trade associations, which that's why they exist, to sort of help spot these things, to engage with it, to work to provide an educational opportunity for regulators, and in some cases lobby them so that they sort of understand the effects that their rulemaking might have on industry writ large.
Are you finding that the process is different for the state laws than what you maybe are used to with agencies like ECHA or the EPA?
So the process of rulemaking is going to change wherever you are. Fortunately, in the United States, when you go from a federal rulemaking level to a state level one, the rulemaking sort of follow the same pattern. They mirror each other. They all are guided by administrative procedures that they have to follow, which generally consists of agency will announce that they're sort of doing work in something. You'll see a proposed rule, which you can comment on. I believe every state allows you to comment on any rule. And the federal government certainly lets you do that as well. Mostly it's digital. I think in every state it's also digital. So when you follow the rules and you see it, you can respond. In Canada and Europe, for instance, they follow the same basic levels, but you're going to see differences. Their comment periods are going to differ. The websites might look radically different. In Europe in particular, the rulemaking sort of starts at the executive branch before it even moves to the legislature for approval. In the United States, generally the laws precede what rulemaking activity is out there. So understanding what those different processes are will help you engage with them and understand what the rules are. I find it very helpful to always know what the first proposals are, because then you sort of know what they're thinking, what they're sort of shooting for. A lot of times in PFAS, they might be only focused on consumer applications. We're really concerned about PFAS in cosmetics or something like that. Well, if they're really concerned about cosmetics and they write the rule in a very poorly written way and you're included in the scope, well, then you can argue and say, well, we don't make cosmetics. You should rewrite the law here, here, and here if you're focused on here. So this is all basically a long way of saying understanding the process in each of these different jurisdictions will go a very long way.
Yeah, you almost need a law degree to do that, right? I skipped ahead to this question because I think we kind of meandered into it with that conversation. But do you have any other tips for how an individual manufacturer could, lead this engagement with their regulators, or submit comments or anything like that?
So, generally speaking, there is always going to be a outlet for you to respond to rulemaking, at least in most of the major markets out there. So they'll release the rule, and then it's up to, like, if you're trying to do it on yourself, if you're a manufacturer and you want to respond to these, being able to know where to look to see these rules as they pop up, and then being able to respond on your own. If you want to do that, there's nothing, anyone can respond to a comment. There's no restriction on that. And many of our members will respond with comments on their own. But at the same time, if they want to respond from an industry's perspective because they don't want to call themselves out, or they want to engage in an umbrella group that's much larger than any single company, then you go through your trade association to respond on your behalf. And then they sort of respond with industry level comments. But the best way, though, to do it is to understand what the process is that any regulator is doing. And I don't have links at the ready to provide you for, like, going to the Federal Register, for instance. That's the U.S. federal government publishes almost every rule in the Federal Register, and you have to check it on a daily basis. But that is a way that you will literally catch every rule or action that they're taking. It's not all rulemaking, but it is an easy way to just see, oh, well, this is what affects me, and I should look at this rule and understand it and potentially comment if it makes sense.
Yeah. You probably need to add the EU's official journal and the Canada Gazette to that, right? So what a great way to start every day. I do see quite a few questions over on the side, and we are absolutely going to have some time to get to those. So please keep adding them, upvoting them, because we'll get to those after we finish up here with Jason. But I've got one last question for you, Jason. What are some of the things that you and AEM have done to address these PFAS business risks? And again, to me, the business risks are far beyond just the regulations, but that supply chain obsolescence aspect that we talked about as well. What are some of the tips and tools that AEM is leading?
So I've already said multiple times that we do engagement with regulators, so I won't go into that. But we write comments, we do all those sorts of things.
So.
It's important,
yeah.
But I won't hammer that home anymore. But we will also write, we produce a lot of educational material for any policymaker, if it's someone from the legislative level or someone from the executive branch. So we write position papers, memos, and it just sort of positions our industry as to what we think the government or any sort of policymaker should do when they sort of start approaching how to regulate PFAS. On the back end, though, what we'll do internally, and this is sort of the general compliance work, is we, at least in my industry, we find it very useful, especially when you're trying to get information from the supply chain itself, is that you coordinate on how you ask these questions to them. Because the big concern is, AEM has like 1,100, 1,200 different members, 400 of them are OEMs, and then there's a variety of different tier one suppliers, and they're all going to be asking their supply chains the same type of questions 500, 600 different ways, which is not viable if you're a small manufacturer. Even if you know all the information, now you've got to fill out hundreds of different forms just to answer your customers' questions. So what we try to do at an industry level is coordinate our responses. So what type of form should we be putting out there? Recently, within the next week here, we're going to be publishing on our website a list of chemicals of concern. I'll call it, things that are regulated around the world. We call it the HEDSL list, the Heavy Equipment Declarable Substance list. This is so that you're not getting asked 500 different versions of the same type of list. You're getting asked a single list, at least from our industries. And it's meant to ease the burden, the reporting burden on the supply chain, in order for everyone to sort of know, okay, well, this is what's in the product. These are where our big risk factors are. And this is how we protect ourselves from that supply chain obsolescence. Mm-hmm. And then we will also provide, at least at an AEM level, a variety of different educational tools for the members themselves to help make sure that they're fully aware of all the compliance issues that sort of rise from these different rules, so that they're ready. Because we have OEMs of various sizes, and some are much more equipped or have more resources to deal with these issues than others.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of the things that AEM is doing. I realize not everyone on the call is in the heavy equipment industry, but certainly everyone has their own industry groups. And I know in my previous experience working in manufacturing, those were always invaluable sources of support across all product compliance requirements. So definitely happy to have you here today sharing that. We have a lot of questions that are really focused. I'm looking at them on suppliers. So I'm going to get to that in just a moment, but I'm going to try to knock off a few of these easy ones here before we talk about suppliers. And maybe you can just mull this over, Jason. We're going to talk about how to work with suppliers who don't respond to requests for data, right? So, but the first question I have is around 3M. 3M has reacted. What about foreign industries in the same kind of business? I am finding other chemical companies are quietly discontinuing certain PFAS product lines. I don't know if they don't want to really draw that much attention to themselves that they're making PFAS, but they are quietly discontinuing them. No one is doing it in a big splashy way, the way that 3M has, but they are starting to decrease through the supply chain. 3M is still on track to discontinue by the end of 2025. For those of you who keep up with 3M's obsolescence list, just so you know, they updated that list in July. So you may want to go re-download it. They're currently at around 22,000 products that they are discontinuing, which is actually a little bit of a drop down because in January they updated that list to 25,000 products. So I'm not sure yet what fell off or why, but there are other chemical companies, again, reducing their manufacture of PFAS, and that is going to trigger that supply chain obsolescence that Jason and I have been talking about. But did want to mention that there's also a question about what information is required in the reporting obligation in Canada. The information data points are not really different than the TSCA reporting data points, but there's a lot of other conditions around the Canadian rule as far as who has to report. You have to trigger certain volumes per year. This is just for 1 year. It's for 2023. It doesn't have the long look back period the way the EPA does. And there's a lot of conditions, and depending on which of those conditions you hit will determine which reporting data you have to provide. So definitely recommend checking the Canadian Gazette to find the full publication of the rule because they do outline all of that. Also, coincidentally, I had a blog post posted yesterday on this particular rule where I go into a lot more information on it. But of course, going to the source and what the regulators are publishing, always the best bet. And again, there's nothing majorly different here, but it's just going to vary based on which PFAS you're reporting and what your volumes are. So those are some of the reporting. Someone also asked about the CDX on November 12th. CDX is the Central Data Exchange. That is the EPA's information portal. What's going to happen on November 12th is that the TSCA Section 8A7 rulemaking reporting will open. For most manufacturers, that will close on May 8th of 2025. The Canada date, Jason, is now going to fall right in the middle of that time frame. So in my opinion, Canada just kind of leapfrogged over the US as far as PFAS reporting goes. But let's jump back to that question that I asked you to mull over there. What do we do when our suppliers don't provide information? This is the number one question we have here today. I have definite thoughts on that from my previous life of collecting data in manufacturing. I don't know if you have any suggestions as well.
So once upon a time, I did used to belong to a chemical manufacturer and had to respond to these for our customers and ask questions from our suppliers as well. When I was in that position, when you want to have this information, if you and your company deem it high enough priority and you absolutely need it, there are different avenues you could take. I used to go to our supply chain department and say, we need to put it into our contracting to to say this is what you need to do in order to continue to be a supplier for my company, chemical company XYZ. You can just continue to ask nicely. You can provide educational information to them, which is what I did in many of these, especially for the smaller ones. If you're dealing with a very large company, if you're literally trying to ask Dow Chemical or DuPont or any of the major companies, they likely understand these sorts of concepts, but whether or not they have the capacity or bandwidth to respond to every one of the questions is always an issue with industry. So there's continuing to ask, there's putting it into your contracting and terms and conditions. When I removed that industry hat, or the company hat, I moved to an industry level. Some of the requirements, and I'll pick on the 8A7 rule in particular, is that the EPA has gone out of their way to help define what is known and reasonably ascertainable. So if you're trying to specifically comply with that rule, what you need to know is it's a due diligence exercise. They understand, the EPA very well understands that industry has not historically collected this information, especially for article manufacturing. So they want you to ask, they want you to find out, because at the end of the day, they want that information to write future rules. But they understand you're likely not going to get it, but they want you to see if you can try and collect it. So your job as a compliance professional is to show them, I don't want to say go through the motions, but it's going through the exercise of trying to collect this information, asking them, confirming, sending multiple emails if you have to, whatever you feel is necessary to complete it. And you document these things so that you've demonstrated that you've done everything you can within reason to collect this information. And then if the EPA ever were to knock on your door saying, hey, we want to know what you tried to do, you can tell them, I tried everything. I've sent out emails. I've documented it all, and you've done your due diligence. You've met the known and reasonably ascertainable aspect of that rule.
Yeah, exactly. Keeping the documentation is very important, and I don't know that the EPA expects everyone's going to be able to go back to 2011, but of course that was the way Congress wrote the law, right? So they couldn't really change that. I do think it's important to educate your suppliers. So we have a lot of customers who have us do supplier training for them. We see an immediate increase in their supplier responsiveness after those webinars. So I do think educating suppliers, I'm really happy you mentioned the terms and conditions or supplier code of conduct to make it very clear what your expectations and obligations for your suppliers are, and then enforce those, right? We used to use supplier responsiveness at one of my former employers as part of our supplier health metrics. And suppliers who did not respond to our requests for, say, ROS data or REACH data, they were not awarded new business by us, right? So I think there's a lot of things you can do to encourage your suppliers. This isn't just related to PFAS, but really for all data collection. But education is probably step one. Otherwise, you can't really trust what they would respond to you anyway if you don't feel that they understand what you're asking. So that is one way that you could provide. Now, back to Section 8A7, you're absolutely right, Jason. It has this due diligence obligation. Not all laws are going to have that, though. So even if you don't get it for 8A7, I think it's still worth continuing to try to partner with your suppliers, or at the end of the day, find new suppliers. And just for all of you on the call, both Jason and I have been on both sides of that, right? Having to provide information, having to ask for information. I'm sure we have a lot of stories that we could tell, but those are some of the things that I have found have been more successful. Communicating that expectation and then following through for any type of materials compliance regulation. Let's see, we're finding suppliers are reporting vastly different amounts of PFAS for the same products. So again, this maybe comes back to trusting what your suppliers are providing for you. So if you are testing and coming back with something that's different than your supplier provided to you, that's probably a concern, and it goes back to your supplier quality program. So you have to have a good supplier quality program. And again, this is not any different than if you were to ask your suppliers for EU ROS data, and one says, we don't have any ROS substances at all, and the other says, yes, we do, and we're using this exemption. now there's a problem, right? So just like the terms and conditions, supplier code of conduct, I think supplier quality program is really important for all of your materials compliance. And if you are finding different answers or things that you don't trust, probably get your quality team involved in that to understand where that supplier is. Jason, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on supplier quality and supplier trustworthiness overall.
I think, at least from an AEM perspective, our members have their own, just like you just defined there, that you used to have a rating system for your suppliers. It will be up to you individually to sort of gauge the accuracy of the data that they report. And if you're buying like a gasket that you know is 100% Viton, for instance, and they say there's none in there, well, it's going to be up to you to gauge that they just don't fully understand what they're answering there. There's no easy way to do that other than if you have a lot of different suppliers and you could start to see patterns emerge. But ultimately, it's going to require a bit of awareness on your part as you're reviewing this data to understand what is reasonable and what is not. Can people still hear me?
Yes, Callie just dropped there. Sorry, the internet dropped. Thanks for that. I did want to just comment, Tanya, on one last question, only because it's only got one upvote, but I am getting asked this more often. How do you see the Chevron SCOTUS ruling affecting the TSCA reporting requirement? I'll give my quick answer, and then Jason, you can add if you have anything. I don't see the Chevron ruling affecting this at all because TSCA 8A7 was actually amended and added by Congress. This was not an EPA rule. This was congressional authority that dictated it. So I don't really feel that Chevron has any application here. I don't think Chevron will slow it down because, again, the EPA is actually just following the direction of Congress for this particular rule. I don't know, Jason, if you've dealt with that on your side at AEM.
Yeah, we're getting the same type of questions. What does Chevron mean? And I just fully support what you're saying. Congress passed it, and EPA stuck very closely to the letter of the law. And likely they stuck close to it because if they were to diverge, and I know that I spoke before how they know that they're not going to get all this information, so the accuracy is going to be somewhat questionable. I'm sure some of them were like, could we diverge? But they don't because then they risk lawsuits themselves. So in this case, yeah, Congress was very specific. They implemented into a rulemaking, and here we are.
Yeah. So, sorry for those of you who were hoping for otherwise, but I don't really see Chevron slowing things down at this point. I think, Tanya, I know there were a lot more questions, and I wish we had another hour to go through them, and I would love to talk to Jason for another hour, but unfortunately, I think we're at the end of our time. But as you mentioned, Tanya, our account executives and customer support folks can follow up with our customers who ask questions here, and we'll be sure to get you those answers as well.
Absolutely. Kylie, Jason, thank you so much for just a great conversation and, addressing our questions for our audience. For those of you who are on today's call and you would love to meet Callie in person, the October 9th and 10th, we're going to be in Nashville. That's our yearly conference, Evolve 2024. And under the doc section, just for our attendees today, we've got a discount code for our in-person event. It also will work for the live streaming. So we will be live streaming the first part of that October 10th content, where you can hear a lot more about PFAS and more about Ascent. Again, I'm going to thank our audience for participating with us today. And thank you, Jason. It was a pleasure to have you. And Callie, again, always a pleasure. I wish everyone a wonderful day. Take care.
What a class!